Friday, August 26, 2016, Monaco 64 here, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. I'd like to talk about who really owns the Federal Reserve system. The Board of Governors has come up with a new Facebook page, Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and I think they're going to take this down because, they're trying to do a PR exercise for people to look into the Federal Reserve. And one of the posts they had yesterday was, we are often asked who owns the Federal Reserve, and they say the Federal Reserve System is not owned by anyone. So I've done a little bit of digging and I've followed the money. And one thing I found is that Section 5 of the Federal Reserve Act called for member banks of, the district banks, which are the 12 different banks. Member banks needs to buy and hold stock in the district Federal Reserve Bank equal to 6% of its capital and surplus. So there you have it. And it's even on the Federal Reserve.gov website. If you go about the Federal Reserve, it has that. It's public. So the other thing I've done is looked at the Federal Reserve balance sheet, which is also publicly available, and they update it daily. So I've got it as a bookmark. So the Federal Reserve has a total around 4.5 trillion of assets on its balance sheets. Then you scroll down to the item number 6 on this list of assets and liabilities, and they've got all the 12 different Federal Reserve banks, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, etc. The total assets of the Federal Reserve System is 4,473,840,000, and the New York Fed has 2.57 trillion of that, so more than half of the assets. So that's why the New York Fed is always a voting member of the FOMC. They own more than half of the Federal Reserve. And one thing I've noticed, there's the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, which is appointed by the president, supposedly. Well, it is, but is it really independent? They've got no assets. So there you have it. It's the Federal Reserve district banks that own the Federal Reserve, and especially the New York Fed. They own more than 50% of the Fed balance sheet. So, and they might say, oh, but it's the president that appoints the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and all the other Board of Governors. They're independent. Well, let me tell you something. I bought this book a few years ago, Alan Greenspan, The Age of Turbulence, and you might say, why did you buy this book? Well, sometimes you need to know what your opponents think. You need to know your enemy better than your friends. So on page 78, he's talking about in 1977 when he left the Ford administration as an advisor. He says on page 78, among all the boards I joined, J.P. Morgan's was the one that I found most engaging. It was a holding company of Morgan Guarantee, arguably the world's premier bank. And then he goes on to say, first time I sat in that boardroom, I felt a little intimidated. There was a portrait of J.P. Morgan on the wall above the board table, and where I happened to be seated. And I raised my head, and he was looking right at me. So, yes, 10 years later, he would be appointed, yes, by President Reagan, to be chairman of the Federal Reserve System. I wonder if J.P. Morgan had any, say in this, J.P. Morgan Bank. And then I looked at his predecessor, Paul Adolph Volcker Jr., or Paul Volcker. And in his Wikipedia page, it says he joined in 1952. He joined the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as a full-time economist. And then he left the position in 1957 to become a financial economist with Chase Manhattan Bank. So, and then, I go to this book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve by Eustace Mullen. I recommend this book. And on page 179, there's an addendum And it gives a list of the major shareholders in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as of July 26, 1983. I know it's old, but apparently these 10 banks own 66% of the outstanding shares of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, even though at the time there's 27 banks that owned the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And out of these 10, Chase Manhattan Bank, Paul Volcker's bank, owned 14%, Citibank 15%, Morgan Guaranty Trust 9%. As you know, JP Morgan and Chase merged in the 90s. So, they own more than 20% as of 1983. I don't know now how much they own of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But you can see, it's all the private banks that own the Federal Reserve district banks. And it's the Federal Reserve district banks who own the assets of the Federal Reserve System. So when the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve says that no one really owns the system, they're really, maybe de jure, they're being correct. But de facto, they're not, or they're just being economical with the truth. So now you can understand why the Federal Reserve bailed out, with the help of the government, why they bailed out the big New York banks, and why they're trying to desperately keep these banks propped up, because they own the Federal Reserve, and it's all public information. So there you go. I would say then that now we need to know, who owns the big New York banks. And I'm sure the people behind it, the families that own it, they're hidden behind trusts and, I don't know, holding companies. But you can imagine who they are. So it's JP Morgan, Chase, Citibank, Goldman Sachs. Those are the owners of this Federal Reserve System. It's not the government that owns it. And it's clearly provable. It's all public information. And I'll put the links to all these things I've been talking about, the Federal Reserve balance sheet, Section 5 of the Federal Reserve Act, which says that, the member banks of the Federal Reserve Bank, district banks, have to own 6% of the, buy 6% of their, equivalent of their capital stock in the Federal Reserve banks. So if you enjoy this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you think my videos add value to your knowledge and you enjoy it, feel free to donate. I accept Bitcoin. You can donate via PayPal and Patreon. I got a few links below to those. And there you have it. It's the banks that own the Federal Reserve System, not the government. Take care. Bye.